The ancient apartment building was somehow still standing after about 100 years, though it was mainly preserved for its historical value. The rent was high, but it was definitely worth it to those who preferred to live in such a lovely building. The apartments were large, roofs high. All the hardware such as wall lights, chandeliers, and wooden floors were mostly original or at least updated in the 40s or 50s. It had all the turn-of-the-century charm you would expect for $2 grand a month. Artists, retirees, young professionals with a flair for the dramatic. Everyone who resided here had a style and a certain coolness. It was a young artisan's dream to live in downtown San Antonio in a well-kept, 100-plus-year-old building. It had a certain energy to it. You could almost see the old spirits walking around, standing in doorways, on stairs. They were watching you, curious, envious of you and your years ahead. The energy was strong, there was no denying it, cop or not. All of downtown San Antonio had the same energy everywhere you went. The best time to see it all up close, to walk the streets, was at night. There's just something magical about it all, despite the darkness everywhere. Chris opened the entrance door and was greeted by the warm glow of dim, soft-lit wall lanterns and a rustic staircase just ahead on the right. The manager's office and apartment were on the first floor. The resident apartments began on the second floor. The place was old like Chris's building, yet it seemed happier than the riffraff where he lived. His place housed many who were near the end of their rope. Chris expected the cast of cats to come waltzing out in feather boas, prancing around. Michael looked around, admiring all the classic, mostly original aspects of the building. Even a couple of straight cops could appreciate the aesthetic value of the place. "What apartment number again?" Michael asked, looking at Chris, who was standing at his right. 402, Chris answered as he stepped onto the elegant staircase. A loud squeak echoed through the building, alerting all tenants that they had visitors on the premises. If you were a resident, you knew the silent spot on the first stair near the railing. Otherwise, it acted as a communal doorbell. "This has gotta be weird for you, just a little, right?" Michael asked Chris as they walked up the squeaky stairs. "Yeah, maybe a little. But think of how she'll react when she finds out who I am. Talk about old ghosts," Chris said as he cleared the first staircase. Michael imagined what Chloe Marks looked like. He tried to picture her in that house, and Chris as a young deputy walking in, pistol drawn to rescue her. He wondered if she would remember Chris. He probably looked a lot different now. He was older, worn, torn, rode hard, and put away wet. Tragedy adds a few years to your looks. Chris was barely 40 but looked 45. He didn't want to worry about combing his hair anymore, so he used the #1 setting on his clippers when he buzzed his own hair every week. Short but stylish, like Tyler Durden or Beckham, but darker. Chris always had stubble or a light beard. The wrinkles around the corner of his eyes indicated that he was once a happy man, when he still had that spark. The softer wrinkles in between his eyes on his forehead indicated his sadness in recent years. He was still considered attractive in a rugged sort of way. Michael, on the other hand, was always dressed to the nines. Short, perfect hair, clean-shaven, handsome suit and tie, polished dress suits, size 10.5. Michael stood 5'9", while Chris was much taller. They were quite the odd couple when out and about. Regardless, they somehow clicked. "You know, I'm actually a bit nervous for you, man. This is kind of exciting, like those reunion shows. Too bad there's not a camera crew to film this," Michael said with a slight laugh. Chris nodded his head as he continued to walk up the second flight of stairs leading up to the third floor. "He's here all week, folks," Michael laughed. "Almost there, old man." "Old? I'll show you old," Michael said as he began to run up the last flight of stairs leading up to the fourth floor. Michael tried to catch up, but Chris, being taller, took longer strides, skipping a few steps in between. Michael's laughter echoed throughout the building. A few tenants on the fourth floor poked their heads out to see what the ruckus was about. Chris called out, reassuring them, "Don't worry, police," he said, trying to keep his laugh inside. Michael finally caught up with him on the fourth floor. The tenants returned to their apartments. "You okay?" asked Chris. "Yeah, I'm fine," said Michael, panting lightly. "Catch your breath and get into character. We don't want her answering the door to a guy panting like a pervert, Chris told Michael. Michael, catching his breath, looked up at Chris laughing. Fuck you, dude. Chris laughed at his comeback. He nodded his head to the first door on the right. 402, that's her. Let's get into character, he said as he lightly backhanded Michael's shoulder and took a few steps over to the old door. Michael followed. They looked at each other, trying not to laugh and trying really hard to get into cop mode. You gonna do the honors? Michael asked. Chris knocked on the door with a loud police knock. They both held their hands clasped in front of them, listening for movement within. The tiny light in the peephole went dark for a few seconds. Upon seeing this, they reached for their badges and Chris spoke up in his cop voice. Ma'am, San Antonio Police Department, I'm Detective Priest, and this is Detective Rodriguez. We'd like a moment of your time. Regarding? A young woman's voice asked from behind the door. Ma'am, are you Chloe Marks, who goes by the screen name Sarah Meadow Massacre on creepypasta.com? Chris asked. She didn't answer. The sound of the chain lock unhinging from the door followed. The other two locks unlocked as Chris and Michael looked at each other again, ready for anything. A young, attractive blonde-haired woman opened the door. She was wearing a Queen t-shirt and maroon sweatpants. She was pretty, but looked like she could handle herself as push came to shove. Yeah, that's me. What's this about? She questioned, not recognizing Chris. Miss Marks, we're currently working on a case that has a connection to the website creepypasta.com. We think you may be of some assistance, Chris answered. Chloe strained one eye, focusing on Chris. I know you from somewhere? Chris looked at Michael, who was now trying to hide his smile. Turning back at Chloe, he said, Yes, you do, from Lytle. I was the much younger deputy at the time who assisted in your rescue. Chloe's eyes widened with a look of shock. Oh my god, I knew it! There was an uncomfortable silence between them. Michael broke the ice. Miss Marks, may we come in and discuss this in private? Chloe snapped out of it, looking at Michael. Sure, come in. She opened the door fully ajar and stood against the wall, clearing the way for the detectives. Suddenly, recalling she had a few clothes lying around, she said, Sorry for the mess. The maid has the day off. Oh, don't even worry about it. You should see my place, Chris said, helping her save face. They made their way into the living room and waited for Chloe to invite them to sit down. Have a seat, guys. Can I get you anything? She asked, trying to play the good hostess. No thanks, we're good, Chris answered as he and Michael sat down on the brown leather sofa. Wow, you have to forgive me for my reaction, Detective. It's just that, well, it's strange seeing you again. I mean, you obviously know who I am and have read my story, she asked Chris. Yes, we have, he replied. I'm not in trouble for writing it, am I? I mean, I changed the names of everyone involved. Chloe was apprehensive. Michael answered before Chris could open his mouth. No, not at all. Like you said earlier, we are working on a case that's related to scarypasta.com. What does this have to do with me then? Chloe asked them. The reason why we're here rehashing old memories is because there was a murder a few days ago in the King William district. It's been on the news. Male, age 68, murdered in his living room. Chris asked, inquiring if she knew about it yet. Chloe, now with a suspicious look, said, Yeah. Well, what we didn't release to the public is that the victim's eyes were removed, placed into his mouth. His throat was slashed and he was holding a lemon, and a link to scarypasta.com was carved into his forearm. It was to the story of him holding a lemon, Chris explained. Wow, that's crazy. You don't think I had something to do with it, do you? Chloe asked with a concerned look. No. We need assistance from someone local who knows this scary pasta world, a consultant if you will. You will get paid for your time. We can get a court order excusing you from work. It's your chance to use your expertise to help catch a killer. Chris had made an attempt at sweetening the deal and appealing to her pride. What do you say? Will you help us? Michael asked. Chloe thought for a moment, staring at the wall behind them. It's kind of funny, you know. I wanted to try my hand at writing. I recounted my life with those two psychos and typed it out for the world to see. Now, a ghost from the past comes back into my life, asking for my help. The very one who untied me all those years ago. It's like I'm always meant to be connected to certain people, you know? I can't seem to escape the past. Michael and Chris looked at each other once again. At that moment, Chris's cell phone rang. It was dispatch. Patrol unit responded to a 911 call. It was another homicide. The victim had a web link carved into her forearm. Looks like it might be a second murder, which could make it the work of a serial killer. Since there was a discovery of web link mutilation, they were asked to report to the scene. The medical examiner and photographers were already on scene. CSI was en route. Chris filled them in on the findings and the fact that it was likely connected to their case. Chloe, I know it's strange, you and I meeting again like this, all these years later. But there's a killer out there and you can help stop him. Innocent people are getting hurt because of this guy. Come on, please, help us. Chris pleaded with Chloe one last time before they had to leave. Chloe was still indecisive. The chance to work with police, the chance to catch a killer, might make a great story. Besides that, this man had once saved her life. She knew it was the right thing to do, she owed him. Still, she was hesitant to get involved. She felt like she was put on the spot. Her life was simple, right? Go to work, come home, write some more. She wanted to keep her simple, boring life. Her days of excitement and partying and drama were behind her. She couldn't make a decision now, she needed time to think about it. I can't decide this right now. I mean, this is big. I'm not qualified to catch a serial killer, she said, trying to convince herself she wasn't right for the job. Okay, sorry to have inconvenienced you in any way. Stay warm. Here's my card. Call me if you change your mind. Have a good night, Sarah. Chris called her by the name she went by so many years when he saved her life. He was laying on the guilt something thick. Michael opened the door and waited for Chris to follow. Chris, you gotta go, man. She's not gonna help us. This was just a big waste of time, he said, shaking his head. Chris turned around and made his way towards the door, disappointed. As he exited the door, Michael gave one final look of disappointment to Chloe before following Chris. He didn't even have to speak. His look said, "Shame on you, you ungrateful little shit." Chloe shut the door behind them slowly. Michael spoke a few comforting words to Chris. Sorry, man, you tried. No chick flick moment for them. Chloe's help could have been tremendous. She could have provided them with some great insight on the killer's methods, his reasoning, his way of thinking. Together, they could have even predicted his next move, maybe even stopped him from taking another life. Now there's been another needless death. This city was definitely going to hell in a handbasket. I tried. Some people are just born victims, I guess. Oh well, fuck it, Chris said. We got shit to do. Chris and Michael made their way back down the stairs, walking the whole way down, one floor at a time. This time there would be no race to the finish. The dead weren't going anywhere. Don't know about you, Mikey, but at the end of the night, I'm getting good and drunk, Chris said as they neared the first floor, side by side. I don't know. Maybe after we leave the crime scene, that may not be a bad idea. Been a while, Michael said as they walked to the main door. Chris opened the door to a freezing Arctic blast of snowy wind. He squinted his eyes as it stung his face. God damn, Chris shouted as he looked back to see Michael squinting as well. Michael closed the door to the warmth of the lobby. Why do we have to work on a night like this? Michael shouted. For the free coffee and donuts? Chris joked. They both walked, hands in their pockets, headed towards Miss Sunshine, whom they parked curbside in the front of the apartment building. Michael waited at the passenger side for Chris, who was walking over to the driver's side. Cold enough for you, Brohim? Chris asked Michael as he prolonged unlocking the car doors. Chris, unlock the fucking door, man. I'm freezing my nuts off here, Michael yelled at Chris. You know, I remember the winter of '85. It snowed that day too. Chris said with a smirk, prolonging even further. Come on, man, Michael yelled. The sound of the car doors unlocking echoed, and Michael took his hands out of his pockets and quickly opened the door and entered the Camaro. He slammed the door and put on his seatbelt. Chris followed suit, laughing. Sorry, buddy. Just had to lighten the mood a little. Chris explained his actions. Michael looked at him and said, You asshole. Chris laughed a hearty laugh again. I can always count on you for a laugh, little buddy. Chris fit the key into the ignition and started her up. He always let her warm up in the winter. Chris looked out of the driver's side windows and stared for a moment. Michael stared out of the passenger side. Hey, you want to grab some coffee first? Chris asked Michael, trying to get back on his good side. Yeah, sure, but let's go to Starbucks. I want one of those mint mocha lattes. He accepted Chris' subtle apology. Yeah, guess I could go for one of those pumpkin spice coffees. I won't call it a fucking latte though, Chris said with a slight laugh. Hey, wait up, I'll help you. Wait up, guys. Chloe yelled as she opened the apartment door and waved at them. They both stared at her. She was wearing a black hooded parka, jeans, and brown Uggs. She closed the door behind her and tried to run down the steps carefully while holding onto the railing. I'll be damned. Guess she couldn't stay away, Chris said arrogantly, smiling. As Chloe made her way over to the Camaro, Michael opened the door and exited, standing up behind the car door. Are you sure you want to get involved? It won't be pretty, Michael warned her one last time. No turning back now. It was do or die. She would never get another chance like this again, and she knew it. I'm sure, she yelled. Michael stepped out of the way and opened the door, pulling his seat forward so she could climb in the back. Get in, we gotta go. Chloe climbed her way to the back seat behind Michael. It was cramped. If you have ever been in the back of a Camaro, you get it. I want to help, she told Chris as she settled in. Michael sat back down in the car and slammed the heavy door. Chris was glad. With Chloe's help, this investigation will likely be a bit easier now. Okay, you stay with us. Don't speak unless spoken to and don't touch anything. If we find something of significance, we'll tell you, he explained. Shut up and stay out of the way, but stay with you guys. Got it, Chloe assured them. Get it, got it, good. Let's go, said Michael, eager to get to the crime scene, forgetting about Starbucks. With that, they departed for the crime scene at the edge of downtown, this time on the poor side of the tracks. It wasn't too far from Chloe's elegant abode. So, Chloe, what do you do for a living nowadays? I mean, hard to make a living as a writer. Chris made small talk with Chloe to calm her nerves. I work in mortgage fulfillment. I help people trying to get a home loan, nothing to write home about. It pays well, but as you may know by now, writing is my true passion now. I never knew I'd be good at it. It's actually pretty easy for me, she said, finally relaxing in the backseat. That's good. Never had the patience for writing myself. We write a lot of reports. They have to be perfect for the DA when they're used in court. A lot of editing, descriptive details. I do enough of that shit already, Chris said, trying to justify why he never got around to writing. But you see, that's precisely what you are doing. You are writing. I mean, with all you've seen, you could write several novels. Just take bits and pieces from cases and jumble it all together. Boom. You have the makings of a novel. You should try it sometimes. I'm sure it could be also therapeutic for someone who's seen what you have. Chloe went on about writing, trying to convince Chris he had everything he needed to write. How about you? I heard you married Sheriff Allen's daughter, Chloe asked, shifting the focus on Chris. Chris was silent as he drove slowly through the snow. He looked at her in the rearview mirror. Michael looked at Chris, unsure of what was going to be said next, unsure if he should say anything. Chris took a deep breath and exhaled. Yeah, we got married. We even had a son, Chris answered Chloe, looking ahead at the road. Oh, sorry. You guys divorced? Chloe asked, sensing some sort of underlying issue there, unaware of the awful truth. Something like that, Chris answered her, still keeping his focus on the road. Michael looked out the window, biting his tongue. He knew Chris could handle it, though. Sorry, Chloe said in a hushed tone as she looked away from Chris and looked out of the window at the storm and warm glowing streetlights. The memories from so long ago came flooding back. She was so young and naive. She had been taught that the world was an evil place. Those scumbags were now on the ground somewhere, but their ghosts seemed to haunt her still. She recalled suffering many cruel and unusual punishments at the hands of the fiends posing as her parents. In time, she became numb to it all. The only time she ever felt anything was the rare occasion she got to see, much less talk to, other people. Those two crazy kids, Joey and Jason, had changed that for her though. They had been her only real friends up to that point. She still kept in touch with Jason, but that's another story. The car was silent except for the reports on the police radio. Chloe thought it was cool to listen to. Upon studying Chris, he had indeed aged. He was still good looking, but he was no longer that fresh-faced young 20-something-year-old. Life had caught up to him. She looked down at the empty seat on her left. There was an empty bottle of Jim Beam whiskey lying all alone, used up, dried up, a temporary vice to kill the pain. In that instant, she felt sorry for him, just like everyone else. She realized now that his domestic life was likely a big part of the reason for his downward spiral. So, he's an alcoholic. Looks like his troubles run deeper than I thought, she said inside of her head. Upon studying Michael, she noticed a wedding ring. Michael was obviously younger and cute, likely a family man. Wife, a few kids, the whole white picket fence American dream. He was clean-cut, well-dressed, and seemed more put together than Chris, who was likely his mentor. So we got the older, hard-edged, experienced, tortured, brooding detective, and the young, modern, progressive, less experienced, trying to make a name for himself who will likely become chief one day detective. How cliche is that? Chloe thought. So you guys been working together long? She asked. Too long, if you ask me, Michael answered before Chris could speak a single word. He turned to Chris and looked at him with a slight smirk. Chris turned and looked right back at Michael with that same expression. Well, I've been babysitting old Mijo here for about 2 years now, and he loves every minute of it. The rapport between them made Chloe smile. She was seeing a side of the police she had never seen before. She could tell there was a respect between them. They may joke around and act like they can't stand each other, but you know it was just an act. It's how they were. They were more like siblings. Chloe remembered Chris as that young deputy and the sheriff, his mentor. She thought about how life really does move on even after you die. Life and people will always move on. So, Chloe, can you recall what Chris here looked like as a young buck? I'll bet he had more hair then. Was he always this ugly? Michael asked her as he looked over at Chris. He's not ugly, he's handsome. And yeah, he had a little more hair then. He looked happier though, Chloe said, looking at Michael. Chris shot Michael a there you go look. And you, Chloe, you've grown up to be quite the looker yourself. Chris repaid the compliment to Chloe. She really was beautiful. She just didn't doll herself up like all the hoochies out there. His eyes caught a glimpse at Chloe's in the rearview mirror. He quietly looked away, remembering his dead wife and son. This is kind of funny, Chloe said. What's kind of funny? Michael asked. Chloe explained the reason for her amusement. Well, the fact that we're headed to a crime scene, a murder at that, and you guys are all joking around like it's nothing. I guess I figured you guys would be all serious and brooding, preparing yourself mentally for it or something. The detectives looked at each other. Chris attempted to rationalize. You have to have a sense of humor in our line of work. All the ugliness we see, you'd go crazy if you didn't. You know you've been on the job too long when you're standing in front of a house still on fire and one of you asks, anyone bring marshmallows? The snow continued to fall. Chris was beginning to wonder if reaching out to Chloe was a mistake. She was an old ghost from his past and he had enough of those already. Certainly she could be of some help on the case, or was it something more which compelled him to enlist her help? They were now turning right on North St. Mary Street, a block which housed not so well-to-do working-class family. St. Mary's Catholic Church rested at the end of the block. It served as a beacon of hope for those lost souls working themselves to death in the snowy city on fire. Houses were close together like any downtown street, apartment buildings, much like the Camino Real apartments where Chris drank his demons away and slept most of the time. Living room windows were glowing, some still had their Christmas lights up on the outside eaves. There were more clunkers than new cars nestled curbside on both sides of the street. Each and every one was covered in ice and snow. In this neighborhood, everyone looked out for each other. If they needed help, neighbors were there to help. There was a sense of community on this block, unlike many of the surrounding blocks. Really, it all depends on the caliber of people you have around you. The gangs and other scumbags tend to stay away from North St. Mary's. Tonight, though, the first sight you would see were police lights, ambulance, photographers, and other officials littering the city block. The entire neighborhood was out in front of Miss Vera Lopez's house. They were concerned that one of their own had perhaps fallen victim to a horrible crime, the very thing they tried so hard to prevent in their neighborhood. Mrs. Vera Lopez was a widow, drawing on her late husband's social security. She had 3 children, 5 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. She was homebound due to a number of medical conditions such as diabetes, congestive heart failure, and emphysema. She needed oxygen and a smorgasbord of pills to survive daily. She was always friendly to everybody in the neighborhood and never had anything bad to say about anybody. Chris had placed his red flashing lights on his dashboard and pressed a single siren button, catching the attention of everyone. People began to clear the way for the black muscle car. Chris would need to find a spot somewhere down the street to park Miss Sunshine. A uniformed officer waved them down in front of Miss Lopez's house. The front of the house was taped off and the medical examiner was standing in the doorway, looking at everything yet seeing nothing. What had he seen to put him in such a state? Michael rolled down the window to greet the officer curbside. They would have to shout a little over the loud engine of the Camaro. "How's it going, Ray?" Michael asked his buddy from when he was on the beat. "Mike, Chris, it's going." Ray shook his head. His face told of how sick and disappointed in humanity he was at the moment. They both understood that look, that feeling. It's why they did what they did. "You can park over there by the church, fellas," Ray said as he pointed down the street. Michael looked at him and said, "Thanks, Ray." He rolled up the window as Chris began moving the car forward slowly again. "I can't believe she's gone. I just don't get it. She never hurt anybody. She was so nice," said a woman in a white parka, speaking to a woman standing next to her in a purple wool coat. They both were sniffling and wiping their tears. Obviously, they knew Mrs. Lopez. "How can something like this happen here?" a man a few groups away asked his buddy. "It's a damn shame," his friend answered. Both men had their hands in their pockets. Other conversations about how awful this is and how nice Mrs. Lopez had been blended together in a mix of conversations. Chris found an open area in front of the church and parked, leaving the police light flashing on the dash. He turned off the engine and turned back to address Chloe. "Okay, remember what I said. Be quiet, stay close, but don't get in the way. And don't touch anything," Chloe finished his sentence, confirming her understanding. Michael turned back and said, "Relax, just stay close." They all made their way out of the warmth of the car and into the cold, freezing night air, walking on the snow-covered sidewalk towards Mrs. Lopez's house. The crunch of their shoes breaking through the newly fallen snow was amusing to Chloe, as she had never seen snow in person prior to this year. She kept this thought to herself now. She wanted to look like one of them, cool, calm, collected. Chris led the way as Michael tried to keep up. Chloe walked steadily behind Michael, observing the chaos. She tried to soak it all in so that she could recall it later when she wrote about it. The flashing red and blue lights took her back to that night so long ago. She had let all that go though. Maybe it was the motions, like electricity in the air, or the fact that she was about to see a dead body. She noticed a look of shock on the medical examiner's pale face as he stared out from the porch. Maybe the body was torn to shreds or something worse. The 3 of them entered the front yard and made their way up the short sidewalk. Chris's eyes met with the medical examiner. He continued up to the porch where Tony stood. "Tony, you okay, buddy?" Chris asked as he neared closer. "No, I'm not, Chris. Vic is someone I know. Vera Lopez, 75, widowed. She, was stabbed and her eyes removed and placed into her mouth. She has what looked like a web address carved into her left forearm, like Von Trapp. Chris, she was my mother's best friend. I knew this woman most of my life. She was like an aunt to me," Tony said, shaking his head, sniffling and wiping the tears away from his eyes. "I'm just glad my mother isn't around for me to have to tell her the bad news." Chris pulled out his pocketbook and pen, clicking it, and asked Tony, "Do you know of any reason why anybody would want to do this to her?" Tony shook his head. "No, she didn't have any enemies. She was just a kind, sweet old lady." Do you know if she had any contract work done recently? Or had any visitors around lately?" Chris asked. Tony shook his head, still trying to wrap his head around it all. "No, I don't know. Both questions, no." Chris looked at Michael, putting away his pocketbook and pen. "I'm sorry for your loss, buddy," Chris consoled him, slowly patting him on the shoulder. Tony looked up at Chris dead square and in the eye. Just find who did this, Chris. Please. Chris nodded and said, We're gonna. Go ahead and go in now. Tony nodded his head as if giving permission like a relative would. Chris walked up the steps. Michael patted Tony on the arm as he followed Chris. Chloe gave Tony a sympathetic half smile and followed Michael into the house. As the trio entered the small house, there was chaos. CSI was around taking pictures and collecting samples, and uniformed officers were posted near the entrance and around the house. The living room was ahead on the right. Mrs. Lopez was in her bedroom on the left, lying on her queen-size bed. As they carefully walked past the officers and CSI people, the first thing they saw was a message. Written out on the right side wall in blood, it read, Now you sleep. Chloe's eyes fixed on the message. She instantly knew what this was. They walked past the blood-riddled wall and saw Mrs. Lopez lying on her bed in a blood-soaked robe. Holes in her gown from the stabbing were concentrated around her chest. Defensive wounds covered her hands. Blood surrounded her empty eye sockets. Her mouth was slightly open, exposing the eyes inside. She had not bit down on her eyes as they were placed into her mouth post-mortem. Her left robe sleeve was neatly rolled up, exposing the webbing carved into her forearm. Chloe's eyes widened as she covered her mouth, trying not to scream. She spoke a muffled, "Oh my God," and closed her eyes, looking away. She ran outside to vomit. Chris and Michael looked at each other. Michael immediately took 2 pictures of her arm while Chris looked around the room and studied Mrs. Lopez's lifeless corpse. Go and check on her and bring her back in when she's ready. She's a consultant on the case. Chris ordered the uniformed female officer guarding the body. Yes, sir, she said before walking out of the room. Chris and Michael stood over Mrs. Lopez. I count 10 stab wounds to the heart area. Throat wasn't slashed this time. Nothing taken, no signs of forced entry. I wonder if she knew him. But why take out her eyes again and place him in the mouth? Chris stated. Michael shook his head. Damn shame Tony had to see her like this. He looked at Chris and closed his eyes, immediately realizing his folly. Chris had to identify Abby and Connor. I'm sorry, man. Chris's face had grown long as he stared away into his memories. It's okay. Let's work on getting Chloe back in here. Chloe walked back into the room slowly with the female officer ahead of her. Chloe was cringing, trying not to look at Mrs. Lopez. Chris turned to her and asked, You okay? I'll be okay, she answered, trying to get a hold of herself. Chris pointed to the message on the wall and asked, Now you sleep. Do you, know this? Chloe nodded her head, saying, Yes, it's from a pasta called Bob the Murderer. The story goes that Bob was a teenager, around 17 or 18. He was just a normal kid when he was forced to defend himself and his sister from some punks trying to kill them. He was doused with liquor and set on fire, burning his face and all of his hair off. He was in the hospital for a while, and when he was released, he went crazy and killed his whole family. He then went around killing people he randomly chose. Just before stabbing them with a butcher knife, he would say, Now you sleep, in a sort of insane, angry voice. Yeah, I remember the title Bob the Murderer on the site, but never got around to actually reading it. And the story, are the victims always stabbed? Chris questioned her. Yes, Chloe nodded. Wait, how many times was she stabbed? 10 times. Why? Does that mean something? Michael asked. Chloe seemed excited that she knew the answer. Well, yeah. In the story, Bob had a set number of victims he had planned on killing before he was done. He usually left a number at the crime scene. Sometimes he would stab the person the same amount of times as the number of victims that were left, always in the heart and chest. Why 10? Michael asked Chris as they stared at Mrs. Lopez, trying to make sense of it. Hell, 10 is pretty high. This marks number 2. He is definitely just getting started. Chris looked at Michael and said, Okay, go ask Tony if she had any next of kin. We got a hell of a lot of people to question. You take the left side of here, I'll take the right side. Chloe, you come with me. Mikey, call me if something turns up. I'm on it, Michael said as he walked out of the bedroom. With that, they made their way out of the house and parted ways to question the neighbors. From the crowded street, the killer observed the symphony he'd created, blending in with the crowd. He saw Michael, Chris, and Chloe enter and exit the house. Now he knew who was hunting him. The big guy, who seemed to be in charge, was intense looking and focused. The younger, smaller guy looked intelligent and had movie star looks. The woman seemed new to the game, a rookie, although she was a knockout. He looked around once more, soaking in the aftermath, the excitement, the cold night air, and the fear put into the hearts and minds of everyone around him. He had bested this tightly lit block and their neighborhood watch program. Nobody even suspected him. He was just another curious face in the crowd. His work here was done. He crossed the street and blended in with the shadows, disappearing into the night, beaming and aroused. He was God.